Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome William Boyd to the Charleston Festival, as well as Virginia Nicholson in her capacity as chair for this event. William Boyd is one of our most multifaceted authors, a master storyteller who's drawn to narratives about spies and espionage, and, not surprisingly, has just been announced as the next author to write a new James Bond novel. So perhaps James Bond will be introduced to Charleston after all. He's the author of 10 novels, including A Good Man in Africa, winner of the Whitbread and Somerset Maugham Award, An Ice Cream War, winner of the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize and shortlisted for the Booker Prize, Brazzaville Beach, winner of the James Tate Black Memorial Prize, Any Human Heart, recently adapted for Channel 4 drama, Restless, winner of the Costa Novel of the Year, and I gather currently being made into a film, and most recently, Thunderstorms. He's also himself created many film scripts, and just to underline his fascination with subterfuge, he's even invented a spoof artist, the incorrigible Nat Tate. His current novel, Waiting for Sunrise, is set in the cauldron of modernism, the Vienna of Klimt, Schiller, Mahler, Wittgenstein and Freud, as well as in London during World War II, a world of sex, scandal, and of course, spies. Virginia Nicholson is an acclaimed social historian who's also drawn to the arena of war for her narratives, but her focus is the lives of the women who served or who were left behind. Her most recent book, Millions Like Us, Women's Lives During the Second World War, has just been released in paperback. It was preceded by Singled Out, How 2 Million Women Survived Without Men After the First World War. She's also the author of Bohemians and co-author with her late father, Quentin Bell, of an illustrated book on Charleston. And just to emphasize why she's the perfect person to chair this event with William Boyd, as the granddaughter of Vanessa Bell, she's been intimately associated with Charleston, which in its own way is a mini crucible of European modernism on the South Downs since her childhood. And she's also got a very significant connection with spies, insofar as her great-uncle Julian was a close friend of Anthony Blunt at Cambridge. Not that close, obviously. So I'm delighted to hand over to William Boyd. He'll read a bit and talk about his book. He and Virginia will then have a conversation and invite some questions from the audience. William Boyd.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back again at Charleston. Lovely day, resonant atmosphere. In fact, it's ruined my plans for this little talk because I was going to start in Vienna in 1913, which is where the novel begins, but a fair bit of the novel also takes place round about here. So it seemed to me I was missing a trick if I didn't read a little bit from the novel that took place in this part of the world. Why East Sussex? Well, we've already touched on that. It must have been kind of writers' central before the First World War and shortly after, when you think that there was Henry James not far away, and then E.F. Benson, Joseph Conrad, Ford Madox Ford. I think D.H. Lawrence passed through. I've just been in Rottingdean, where Catherine Mansfield lived for a short period of time. There's so many associations with the place, and I know it a little bit because I have friends who live down here. And so when I thought of a bit of pre-war England that I wanted to set a bit of my story in, I thought, where better than East Sussex? And then this maybe give you some indication of how the novelist's perverse mind works. Of all the many beautiful villages in East Sussex, I decided not to choose any of them, but I was going to invent and build my own. It's called Claverley. I'm sure none of you have heard of it. It's not far from Lewes, to the east of Lewes, and there's a large manor house there. and a small church, etc., etc. But I needed somewhere slightly displaced from reality in order to set my fiction going. And time and again, I do this. I needed a big hospital in Southwark for my last novel, Ordinary Thunderstorms, so I built it, having demolished a few streets in the process. But it just makes life a lot easier. Anyway, the bit I'm going to read before Virginia and I get on to talking about the book is, I'm trying to set it up as succinctly and as easily as possible. The character in this, central character in this novel is called Lysander Reef, and he's a young actor on the Edwardian stage. His stepfather is the man who owns the manor house at Claverley, and his widowed mother has married him, and so he goes down there from time to time at weekends to see her and participate in his surrogate family life. At this moment, it begins on a summer evening in the house. His mother was an opera singer. She's just sung a Brahms lied, and Lysander is a bit emotional, and he's planning a walk from Claverley to Winchelsea, which, as you all know, is about 23 miles. And so he's going to. So this is the evening before the walk, and then the walk itself. I hope I haven't made any mistakes. So Virginia told me that Hurstmonceau is pronounced Hurstmonceau, so you're getting the East Sussex pronunciation from me today. Anyway, so here's Lysander looking out over the park at Claverley from the manor house, listening to his mother sing. He felt the emotion well and brim in him, such a simple poem. He stood and crossed to the window as his mother continued singing. He looked out through his reflection in the panes to the darkening park beyond, the sun below the horizon now, though its light still charged and brightened the blue-grey air. The ancient limes, oaks and elms in the fenced enclosure seemed to solidify, losing their individual character as trees, and became great, opaque, shaggy monoliths that, as the remaining sunglow removed itself from them, somehow better revealed the true artful geography of the landscape gardener who, a century before, had placed the feathery saplings here and there on the sides of hillocks on the edge of a small lake and grouped them in gentle valleys to make a near-perfect man-made landscape that he would never see. Chapter 3. The Walk to Winchelsea. The next morning, Lysander was up at 6 o'clock and went down to the kitchen, where he gulped a quick cup of tea and had 2 rounds of cheese and pickle sandwiches made up for him. He had found a pair of corduroy trousers and some mountain boots in his wardrobe, and with a linen jacket and a Panama hat, he was ready for the day. He reckoned it was a 23-mile walk to Winchelsea, more or less straight across country, following lanes and tracks via the villages of Hurstmonceau and Battle, before he briefly joined the main trunk road that would lead him down to the coast at Winchelsea. The day was warm, but there was a threat of showers, according to Marlowe, so he stuffed a rubberized cycling cape in his rucksack, along with his sandwiches and his play script of Miss Julie, and set off across the park, looking for the first of the cart tracks that would lead him east to Hurstmonceau. He made good going in the early morning freshness over the downland, catching glimpses of the silvered sea to his right whenever he hit higher ground and the unfolding valleys opened up to afford him a view southwards. He felt good in himself, as he always did when he was walking with purpose, his mind emptying of everything except what he could see and hear around him, as he skirted the oak and beech copses, following the sunken lanes hedged with hornbeam and blackthorn, hearing a late cuckoo piping its 2-note song, looking down on small farms from ridge paths, crossing trunk roads as quickly as he could, eager to remove himself from traffic and the noisy reminders of the 20th century. They were beginning to cut hay in the fields as he passed, the haymakers scything down the meadows and filling the air with the sweet, pungent scent of grass. Around the middle of the morning, he realized he had slightly lost his bearings. He hadn't seen the sea for an hour, and though he knew he was heading broadly east, the position of the sun told him that, he hadn't come across a fingerpost or a sign for a village for a mile or two. He met a 4-horse wagon jingling up a lane, and asked the carter's boy who was leading the team where he could find the road to Hurstmonceux. The boy told him he'd passed Hurstmonceux and should turn back, but if he went on a ways he'd come to a country church. There was a signpost there that would tell him the directions. He paused at the church, ancient and solid, faced with grey-blue flint, with a battlemented tower and a graveyard half overgrown with nettles, long grass and cow parsley. Gnarled, bent apple trees flanked the cemetery wall. He ate the first of his sandwiches here, and the cheese and pickle gave him a thirst, so he strode on to Battle, finding an old milestone on the verge that told him Battle was 2.5 miles away. Battle with its pubs. He was making good time, pint of ale, cigarette, and he'd be ready to move on again. In Battle he found a pub called the Windmill. It was only just noon, not far from the Abbey. He bought a pint of cloudy ale for 6pence and sat down on a bench seat by the window and watched the 3 haymakers in dirty smocks play dominoes. He took Miss Julie out of his haversack, thinking he really should try and read it through before the rehearsal tomorrow afternoon in St. John's Wood. He read a page or two, then closed the book, thinking that August Strindberg was not part of this world, and it was something of an affront to both Strindberg and the Windmill pub in Battle to introduce them to each other. Sitting in this small pub with its cool flagged floor, listening to the murmuring voices of the haymakers and the click of dominoes falling, drinking beer, here in the middle of summer in England in 1914, he suddenly felt a stillness creep up upon him, as if he were suffering from a form of mental palsy, as if time had stopped and the world's turning also. It was a strange sensation that he would be forever stuck in this late June day in 1914, like a fly in amber, the past as irrelevant to him as the future, a perfect stasis, the most alluring inertia. And then suddenly it was over. The mood passed as a lorry rumbled by, tooting its horn, and the world began to move again. He picked up his rucksack, eased himself into its straps, and took his empty pint glass back to the bar. As he left Battle, it began to drizzle, but he decided to press on, turning off the busy Hastings Road as soon as he could, and following a cart track that a group of foresters cutting lengths of alder told him would see him clear across country to Guestling Thorn. Once he was there, he'd have to brave the verge of the main road to Rye with its motor traffic for a mile or two, but it would lead him straight to Winchelsea and the Major. He liked Winchelsea, he thought, as he entered the village, striding down one of its wide streets to the Major's cottage. All village streets should be this wide, he thought. The village was full of light, open to the sun on its high bluff. The Major's white weather-boarded cottage was on the western edge with a fine view over Rye Bay to Camber Sands and the expanses of Romney Marsh beyond. He knocked on the door. Right, very good.
Will, it's a beautiful bit of pastoral writing with some little stings occasionally that reminds one that it isn't completely Georgian poetry here. There's a bit of Strindberg. Yes. And, of course, there's the menace of the war hanging over it, which we can all see with hindsight. But having commented on that, I'd really like to go back to the origins of the book, right, if we can, which is where you would have begun had we not been in Sussex.
Exactly.
So can you talk a little bit about where the idea came from for Waiting for Sunrise?
Yes, it's odd. I mean, as a writer, you get obsessions for certain cities. And in my case, cities I'd never visited. When I first started writing short stories, I was obsessed with Los Angeles for some reason in the 1970s, and so I wrote a series of short stories set there, and then I got a... Sorry? Hello?
Oh, well. Can you hear? Sound okay?
Yeah.
No, it's gone.
Oh, have I done something bad? So I got a Berlin obsession, and I wrote part of a novel set in Berlin in the 1920s, before I'd ever visited Berlin. And then I had a Lisbon obsession for a while, and wrote a short story set in Lisbon. I have been to all these places, by the way, finally. But then Vienna began to haunt me. Not surprisingly, I suppose, because Vienna, in the first decade or so of the 20th century, must have been the most astonishing and interesting city in the world to be in. I mean, there are cities that are cultural hubs, New York in the 50s or Paris in the 1890s or whatever, but the extraordinary thing about Vienna, it seemed that everything was going on there, not just in terms of art, Klimt, Schiele we've mentioned, but Kokoschka as well, and innumerable others, but music, of course, Schoenberg, Berg, Mahler, but literature. Kafka was in Prague, not far away. Joseph Roth and Schnitzler and Robert Musil were writing. Journalism, Karl Kraus, philosophy, Wittgenstein, the Vienna Circle, and of course...
All of which you've read, I presume.
I'm intimately familiar with them. Yeah, and of course, Sigmund Freud and the birth of psychoanalysis. So that, as if that wasn't enough, you also had, I think, at that moment in Vienna, when this novel starts in 1913, the future of European history, because Hitler was in Vienna in 1913 as a sort of crazed, vagrant figure who has a brief cameo in this novel, unnamed. And Stalin was there for 6 weeks in 1913, and Trotsky lived in Vienna for 6 or 7 years before the First World War, and Tito was working in Vienna as a chauffeur. So it's extraordinary to think that on a given day that these four characters might have walked by each other, little realised, not a big city. If you go to the Café Central, as somebody says, you'll meet everybody in Vienna. But it just adds to that extraordinary kind of ambience. And so that explains my fascination. And eventually, having written a short story about Wittgenstein in Vienna in 1914, having ended a novel by sending my two leading characters off to Vienna for a holiday, I finally got to the place myself to write a piece about Egon Schiele, strange, tormented, amazing artist, died at age 28 from the flu epidemic that swept through the Europe in 1918. And I wrote my piece on Schiele. I had some time off. I thought, I'll go to the Freud Museum, as one does. And the Freud Museum is fascinating because it's in his old apartments. It's not a special building. And it's in number 19 Berggasse, a very famous address. And as I went there very early in the morning, it was in the winter, no tourists, walked through the archway, walked up a couple of flights of stairs to the front door, and there are two doors, one to the consulting rooms and one to the family apartments. And as I stood there, waiting for the door to be opened, I looked around. There was nothing that said 21st century. It was a strange kind of Proustian bit of time travel, and I suddenly thought, I could be here, coming to see Herr Dr. Freud, asking him to explain my curious dreams, and I thought, what must it have been like to have been psychoanalyzed then? It must have been the strangest, most risky, weird thing to do, and so that was the beginning of the novel. It's been a long preamble, but
one hopes,
it was,
I mean, I have to butt in here because having been to the Freud Museum as well, and then the one in London, but it does have that time capsule feel that Charleston does, actually.
Yes,
I mean, one hopes that someone will walk into Charleston, perhaps, and write a novel about that, but this is an aside from...
And that was it.
Yeah.
A young man, somebody comes to Vienna in 1913 to be psychoanalyzed, and that was the beginning of the novel, and the rest of the novel followed my usual question and answer process that takes 2 years or so before I figure the whole thing out. And once I know how it's going to end, then I start writing.
Well, of course, I mean, you talked a bit about Los Angeles and Lisbon and Berlin and all the various places that have interested you as a actually very cosmopolitan writer. But these are the places, they're not the story. Where does the story come out of? How do you create a story out of these things that you've described? I mean, what are the nuts and bolts that you then assemble?
Well, it's a very good question, because it's actually very difficult to do. I mean, people who kind of sort of sneer or dismiss, narrative or storytelling should have a try at it themselves, because try writing a 350-page novel that is, grips the reader from page 1 onwards.
Which it does, by the way.
But so it's an elaborate process, and I mean, that's the kind of novel I like, a complex, multi-layered narrative. But actually constructing a complex, multi-layered narrative takes a tremendous amount of time, particularly one that's got to be plausible and have everything else going on. But it usually starts with things have to happen if you write complicated stories. So I have my initial situation, And this is usually the case in all my novels, and sometimes it can be something that an idea that comes to you that will happen at the end of the novel, but you have this initial situation. In my case, a person. I decided it would be a young English actor, but it could have been a woman or anything, but outside a consulting room, waiting to have his or her problem solved. So you start this chain going, saying, who is this person? So choose the sex, choose the age, choose the name, and the questions you ask yourself, questions you answer, give rise to more questions which have to be answered. And slowly but surely, as you go through this process, you begin to accumulate a kind of aggregate of information about this novel you're going to write. It begins, because I suppose you have to have that kind of mind where you want the narrative to be complicated, that you decide he's going to meet somebody, but this person's going to be complex, telling lies, and so slowly but surely a narrative begins to emerge that you can then manipulate as you see fit. And because I take so long to figure it out, I hope I make all my mistakes in the figuring out stage and not in the writing stage. And I, from this initial idea of a young Englishman wanting to be psychoanalyzed, I had this espionage notion in my head as well. The British Secret Service was founded in 1909, I think. So by 1913, it was a very fledgling operation. And so spying in World War I is in some ways much more interesting than spying today.
But of course, one has to talk a little bit, I think, about the research you did for this, which I'm coming at from the point of view of a social historian. So I was riveted by the tiny details which actually came up very much in the piece you read, like the corduroy trousers and the jingling bells of the cart and the people playing dominoes in a pub. But those are just tiny examples. You've had to do research about early psychology. You've had to do research about this extraordinary place, the Directorate of Movements, this sort of Kafkaesque place in London.
In the War Office.
The War Office. You've had to do research about all hypnosis, all manner of fields. I mean, how do you set about that? Do you just get onto Google like the rest of us?
Google doesn't always work, alas. No, I think it's... I spent many years at Oxford not completing a PhD thesis, so I know how to research. But I think it's about trying to create an authentic world, a textured world. And because you're not writing something scholarly, in a way the novelist has a fantastic advantage in that anything that catches your eye, like a magpie, you can just go and factor it into your novel. So what you're looking for as you read around the subject matters that you're intrigued about are those details that do a lot of work. It's a terrible error to pack your novel with research. You really should sort of throw out 90% because it just slows it down. But what you look for is that one telling moment that somehow brings the world alive.
That's exactly what I recognised in it. I loved your lightness of touch.
Well, it's I mean, maybe the more you do, the better you get.
It's
but
tip of the iceberg time. I mean,
yes, it's a kind of sort of almost throwaway, but it resonates. That if somebody, I remember once in my novel New Confessions, which starts in the First World War, I had a boy running away from school, and he got his bicycle out of the bike sheds, and instead of switching on his light, he had to light a bit of carbide and pop it in the light.
Yes.
Well, this is just a detail, but of course it makes you think, oh, of course, how do you cycle at night in 1914?
But it's not just those things, is it? It's also the assumptions of the time, like the assumptions about the concealment of homosexuality, for example, or about class, or about racial prejudice, or in particular here, you're talking about a world where psychoanalysis was extremely new, and you've had to deal with someone who is experiencing psychoanalysis, and we're all post-Freudians, but Freudianism was something completely new that really hadn't burst on an unsuspecting world. So how do you make us feel that, and yet we're contemporary readers?
Well, I think it is an exercise of your imagination, finally. I think it is about I've never been psychoanalyzed anyway, but let alone psychoanalyzed in Vienna in 1913. So you have to say to yourself, what would it be like? And you can do a certain amount of research to give yourself bits of information, but ultimately you say to yourself, try and imagine what it would be like and what feelings would be going through your head with the information you have, and set your imagination free. And I've discovered over the years and over the 11 novels I've written that actually the area your imagination takes you to often is incredibly close to whatever the truth is. So it's a combination of getting the facts right and then using your imagination. For example, I decided not to. I didn't have Freud in the novel. He is in the novel, but just for a moment. But the psychoanalyst is a fictitious character, and I thought, well, what form of psychoanalysis will he practice? And this is where the novel gives you the freedom. I said, well, you know what? I'll stop researching. I'll make it up.
Well, I think that was just fantastic. I mean, we're going to have people writing PhDs about Boyd and parallelism, aren't we?
Yeah, so my therapy is parallelism, and it's it may work. But it's it's thought through, and I've pinched bits of Henri Bergson, bits of this American poet Wallace Stevens, who I really like. But I've constructed my own sort of pseudo-Freudian therapy, which I remember when I was explaining to somebody in New York, she was nodding, going, "Yeah, that could work for me." And
I think it could work for all of us because it makes the world a happier place.
Yes, it's a kind of I should explain it.
Pollyanna therapy. Really,
you just reinvent your past,
and
you replace the traumatic moment by a richly detailed fictive one. And the more detailed the fictive one is, the more evanescent the real moment seems to be, until, hey presto, you're cured.
But I think we do that all the time.
Yes, we do.
But I mean, I'm also, since you raised it, fascinated by this use of little walk-on parts by real people. And I suppose I have a personal interest in this because it's been done to a number of my relatives. Virginia Woolf has had a part in one of your books. She's had a part in Michael Cunningham's book. A.S. Byatt and I talked about this on the platform a few years ago with reference to the children's book, where another relative of mine, Sir Sidney Olivia, who's on my mother's side, he got a walk-on part. I mean, Sigmund Freud is obviously no relation of mine, but you did this hugely in Any Human Heart. I'm very interested in this because I wonder whether you feel you have a duty towards the real people, or whether they're just props, whether they're cardboard people who you can then make stuff up around. I mean, where do you stand on that?
Well, I think they're usually people I'm very interested in or have strong opinions about. But it's the bigger part of the process is, because my novels are realistic, it's part of that shading fiction into the world of reality, as I've done particularly in 3 books, in New Confessions and in Nat Tate, my art hoax, and in Any Human Heart, where the purpose was that you're reading a work of fiction, but it seems so real that you begin to doubt its fictive status, and that plays with the way you read the book and the way you respond to the book. And it's there in other novels of mine, and in particular this one. I want you to believe absolutely that you're in Vienna in 1913 or in Whitehall in 1915. So how do all sorts of texts can be brought in. But because I was writing about psychoanalysis, I thought I have to get Freud in the picture. And Freud used to go to the same cafe every day. Why wouldn't Lysander Reef walk by it? And equally, because of I wrote a 6-hour mini-series about Adolf Hitler's rise to power. Made. I have all this Hitler knowledge in my head. I like to recycle it. And I knew what Hitler was like in Vienna in 1913. He was like a madman. He wore a yellow cycle jacket, and he had no shirt. So he must have been,
bit
bit
whiffy.
of a pew, you know. So Lysander is walking past this sort of trades union meeting, political speeches being made, and this weird guy in a yellow cycling jacket has a few words with him, and Lysander moves on, but the well-informed will recognise that was Adolf Hitler.
You've been told.
But it is part of a process of making the world of the novel, in a way, colonise the world of the real, the documentary, the historical, and it makes the novel more powerful, I think, when you believe in its fiction.
So you feel it is permissible. In other words, you don't feel any
Yes,
constraint.
I think this is the one you can do. It's the most profoundly generous of art forms. You can do absolutely anything in a novel. To take Virginia Woolf in Any Human Heart. Perhaps I'd spent too long teaching Virginia Woolf, and I wanted my character Logan Mount Stewart to have a bit of a contretemps with her. But he's invited to Garsington, but she was there that afternoon, as I checked in the diaries. And who else was there? Aldous Huxley was there. But they hadn't noticed that Logan Mount Stewart was there. Otherwise, she would have mentioned him.
How could we have overlooked this?
So fact and fiction intermingle, and the fiction, I believe, is empowered thereby, and the truths that our fictions contain are made all the more vibrant and impressive.
Potent, Can we talk a bit about your... I mean, a lot of people describe you in reviews as a wonderful literary craftsman, and I'm constantly very, very struck by your very good writing. I mean, you sometimes also, you do interesting things in Waiting for Sunrise. Sometimes you write in the first person, sometimes you write in the third person. Sometimes, rather unusually, you write in the second person, which is quite a surprise. I mean, what kind of a craftsman are you? Are you like Flaubert? Do you take a week to complete a sentence, or do you scribble away with
I think
panache?
my method is very straightforward now and very long established, and it's not for everybody. I mean, some authors just like to start writing and see where they are led, but I'm not like that, and so I borrow these phrases from Iris Murdoch, who I think worked in the same way. She had what she called the period of invention, followed by a period of composition, and for me the period of invention is twice as long as a period of composition, and it seems to take about 3 years currently. That's my cycle. So for about 2 years I spend my time figuring out this complex narrative, the various themes I want to introduce, the places, and I use old photographs a lot. I use maps and guidebooks particularly if I'm writing in the past, to bring the world alive. But it is a kind of craftsmanship in the sense that the moving parts of the novel all have to fit together. Every gear has to mesh with the next one. And again, it's a hard thing to do, and it's not to be just blithely accepted, particularly by critics. And so this process of getting the machinery of the novel, the stage management of the novel, if you like, absolutely right, takes a long time.
Yes.
Perhaps because I spent so long in university, studying and teaching English literature, I'm like a sort of skilled motor mechanic. I can strip down Wuthering Heights and look at its component parts and then reassemble it and explain to people how she managed to do it. But it's that kind of, maybe it is a technical knowledge.
But I think your familiarity with literature is very, very apparent in the way that you write so well.
Well, I think
I'm just interested. I mean, do you have strong preferences about vocabulary or sentence length or these kind of... I mean, I think a lot of people in the audience probably like to write, and I think they'd be interested to know your views on that.
Well, I think, as Henry James said, the house of fiction has many windows, and I think that there isn't anything you can prescribe. You can write, and I always use this, you can write as simply and as lucidly as James Joyce did in The Dubliners, or you can write as, complexly and incomprehensibly as James Joyce did in Finnegan's Wake. It was his choice, and I think that my own preference is to try and write as limpid but as non-stereotypical English prose as possible. The great enemy is in of fiction is a stereotype, whether it's stereotypical language, stereotypical plot, stereotypical characters. And I believe you can judge books by the number of stereotypes in them. If it's full of stereotypes, it's a bad book. It's lazy. If it's, we all slip up from time to time. But your effort as a serious novelist should be to try to write without any use of stereotypical language. With one lunge, he was by her side. But it's difficult again because so many mundane occasions in English in life have to be described in a novel. And I was reading Vladimir Nabokov, the arch stylist, and the other day, I think in Pale Fire, and he has a sentence, she burst out laughing. He couldn't do any better than that.
Maybe it was
and sometimes we have to, no, he wrote it.
Oh, it was his own in
But
English,
I mean, sometimes you just have to say, he switched off the light and went to sleep, without making it any more complicated than that. But there are other moments where the situation in the novel will allow you to, as it were, unleash your English prose style and do something a little bit more thoughtful and considered. But again, it depends on the moment. I mean, the little bit I read before the walk to Winchelsea is a reflective moment inside Lysander's head, which is quite a long 6-line, 7-line sentence, which took some honing and polishing before it finally worked. Yes. But you wouldn't want to have a paragraph like that in the middle of the scene where he's torturing somebody. You know what I mean? So it's that horses for courses, I think. But you should. But I try to write in as limpid and good a style as I can. Yes. But I don't verge on the side of style.
Sorry, since you raised the torturing scene. I mean, that you wouldn't know from having, if you haven't read the book, from the piece that Will read out, that this rather sort of limpid, beautiful, thoughtful, reflective little scene is in the same book as the piece where Lysander, and we mustn't spoil it, does something very terrible to somebody involving teeth.
Yes, it's.
I mean, I was intrigued by that. It was a very, very powerful, utterly gripping scene. And I wondered what was, how you made that shift and how you got into that. I mean, what's going on inside Will Boyd that he can write a scene of such sadism?
I use my imagination. I haven't tortured anybody, but no, I think it's again, the bit I read was June 1914. The war's going to begin a few months later, and Lysander is recruited. I'm not going to give anything particular away. It's all in the blurb. It becomes a reluctant spy in the fledgling British espionage service. And he's sent on a mission to Geneva, which seems straightforward, but it turns out to be very unstraightforward. And the only way he can extract a piece of information is by constructing a means of torture. And he tries to find the most benign and non-bloody means of torture he can, because, like the rest of us, he's a bit of a coward.
It's very ingenious.
Yes, but,
it's very, very
but
ingenious.
It's, again, that's part of the narrative of taking this young, nice 28-year-old actor, putting him in a situation where his only recourse is somehow to commit an act of violence on this double agent.
But you do make a habit of it. You did it in Ordinary Thunderstorms. Your nice character did something really rather terrible to another character.
Well, it's, yes.
I mean, is there sort of something of the night
going on? Who knows? No, I think it's purely and simply the pressures of the narrative and the building jeopardy or difficulty that the hero or heroine, because I've also written from the point of view of a woman. I mean, the talk about, I don't know if any of you read my novel Restless, the central character, Ava de Lectorskaya, has to kill a Mexican policeman, and the only weapon she has is a very sharp pencil. Now, use your imagination. What would you do?
I'd like to talk a bit about your characters, actually, and particularly because I got fascinated by Hetty Bull, because I think she's one of the most untrustworthy people I've ever met, in recent fiction. And I kept wanting to say to Lysander, don't have anything to do with this woman. And I have problems. Are we supposed to like her, do you think? I mean, I mean, what are your intentions regarding your characters? Is it, do you want to control them? Do you want to control our responses? Or do you want to say, well, okay, reader, it's over to you. Have I got her wrong, or, am I entitled to have that reaction?
I control my characters, absolutely, but I can't control readers' reactions. But I don't care. I think it's something of a terrible burden on serious fiction that people feel they have to like the characters. Who do you like in Macbeth? Who do you like in A Streetcar Named Desire? These great stories don't require a character you have to empathise with. Hetty, I think, is very mad, bad and dangerous to know, but incredibly alluring. And there are those types of people out there in the world. And Lysander can see it, but his head is saying, no, 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 but his heart is saying, bring it on.
Yeah.
So it's a very human dilemma, and we usually succumb. So
you don't think it's necessary to have a central character who readers like? You think it's just enough for us to want to know what happens next? I
genuinely think it's something that's distracting us more and more, and I think it all comes from Hollywood, and it's trickling down to serious fiction. I genuinely don't think, if you're writing a serious novel, if you're writing a genre novel, if you're writing a romance or a rom-com or something, then fine. But I think if you're writing serious fiction, the fact that you like or dislike the central character is utterly irrelevant. And in fact, many of the... Who do you like in Ulysses? Bloom? Stephen? Molly? It's a question that seems almost perverse to ask.
Mightn't that be a shortcoming?
Not in my opinion, no. Who do you like in Madame Bovary? I genuinely think it's a romantic
Like is one
distraction.
thing, rooting for somebody is slightly different, isn't it?
Yes, that's the great Hollywood script editor. Who are we rooting for?
Okay. I'm sure you've had this put to in those development offices
the answer
many a
is
time.
we are rooting for Lysander in the sense that his journey through the book is difficult and complex. He's changed utterly by the end of the book, but he's a complex human being. Bits of him are really nice, and bits of him are not so nice, like all of us. And so, if you're seriously trying to present a realistic portrait of a world and its people, you don't want these paragons stalking its pages. I mean, Henri de Montherlant said, happiness writes white on the page, and it's absolutely right. And you hear this response. I didn't really like your central character, or he seemed to be a bit unpleasant. And you want to say, stand up, anyone who thinks he or she is a really nice person. Nobody will, I guarantee. Human beings are very complicated individuals, and so I think as a writer you have a duty to present that complexity and to ignore absolutely think I must have a character that we're rooting for. Whether it's film, television, drama, fiction, opera, you don't need to like a character in order to experience and enjoy the work of art.
I'll tell you what fascinates me about this is that, to an extent, I think the reader is entitled, when experiencing a novel by a well-known author, to say, okay, this novel is a portrait of the author's mind. Now, to what extent are your characters part of you? To what extent are you your own protagonist?
Well, to a certain extent, of course, it's a portrait of my mind, but...
So what do we conclude?
But let me get my butt in. But I think there are two types of... there are many binary divisions of novelists you can make, and one of the ones is autobiographical or not autobiographical. I think Evelyn Waugh was a very autobiographical writer, surprisingly. Graham Greene sometimes was, but was more non-autobiographical. I'm definitely in the non-autobiographical camp. Of course, you can make some connections between me and my novels, but I'm making it up. That's why I call it a period of invention. I'm inventing characters. I wanted Lysander to meet a very tricky, attractive woman in Vienna.
Sure does.
And so I didn't think which one of my friends or and so I called her Hetty Bull. I gave her physical characteristics, her personality, and her particular traits and quirks of behaviour. and she's sort of, if it's working well, she should just come alive like a real person.
She does.
Yeah.
That's why I got so kind of, Lysander, don't do it, don't do it.
How many people do you know who've made exactly the same mistake as Lysander?
Oh, many,
countless,
yes,
exactly.
Countless.
So it's something that if your creation of a character is working well, then you really don't need any model anywhere to base that person on, I think.
Now, before we open it up, I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about this genre thing, because one of the interesting things, and I don't think this will come as any surprise to your readers, is that we have here a very complex book with two quite identifiable, maybe three genres side by side, the Bildungsroman and the thriller, and possibly the family genre as well, in a sense, it's a sort of family history. And, was that quite deliberate, or is it just what the book is? And, I mean, do you sort of cherry pick?
Yeah, absolutely, and I always have done. I mean, my novel, for example, Blue Afternoon, which is a love story set in the Philippines in 1902, actually has at its root a serial killer murder mystery, because I needed that kind of engine to power my narrative. And so I've often gone to genres to give me narrative energy, and I don't have any problem with that. It's actually not something that doesn't really exist so much in let's say Anglo-Saxon literature. You think of the number of serious novelists who've written spy novels, for example. You start with Joseph Conrad, Graham Greene, Ian McEwan, John Banville, Anthony Burgess, Muriel Spark, etc., etc. Whereas it's very interesting, because I've just been on book tour in Germany and France. There's a huge problem at a critical level of accepting that a serious novelist can write something that's also got a genre spin to it. And so I've come back thinking we are much more sophisticated and relaxed about these things than the French or the Germans are. But I really don't think it's an issue. It's because I write complicated narratives, as I said, things have to happen in them. And the allure of the espionage novel for so many novelists is precisely because in that world you have everything is so rich, betrayal, mendacity, questions of identity, double lives, etc., etc. So why not go to that world to, quarry some of that potency?
Well, why indeed not? And actually, you're fantastic at it. But do you ever think, well, that this... you alluded to it earlier, actually. There was a kind of sense that along with Boyd, the master storyteller, there was a level of sneer from the, as it were, the literary gatekeepers. Do you feel a bit sort of that storytelling is regarded as an inferior art?
I think it is, but only by a tiny number of people who are utterly irrelevant.
So it doesn't bother you?
Doesn't bother me. I mean, I'm a critic myself, so I toil in that vineyard as well. But it's an easy stick to beat the back of a novel with. But in actual fact, it's utterly irrelevant and ephemeral. And the vast majority of readers don't give it a thought. If they're held or compelled and beguiled and shocked or amused by a novel, the last thing they're going to do is say to themselves, actually, should I have enjoyed it this much? So I really, I genuinely, because as I say, because I'm a poacher turned gamekeeper turned poacher, I genuinely don't bother about it, but there's no doubt it exists in a tiny section of the literary world, I would say. But it's not an issue that anybody should worry about.
Last question. What's novel writing about for you? What is the enterprise?
Well, I think it's in a way it's quite simple. The novel is the most wonderful art form, I think, better than any other art form for describing the human condition or the human predicament, this strange adventure that we're all on from cradle to grave. There's something about its scale and its density that does the being human business better than film or the other art form. They have their strengths, but somehow you can write a novel about an hour in somebody's day, and it can be 500 pages long. It's so amazingly capacious and generous, but I think that's what and I think that's why people read novels, because people are opaque, life is mysterious, it's cruel and inexplicable. How do I get any kind of a handle on it? Read a good novel is the answer, I think, because the imagination of the novelist, in a way, is distilling this shared experience that we all have, one way or another, and presenting a picture of our lives. And, even if you've never been a young soldier going over the top in World War I, we've all experienced fear. And somehow, if the novelist is doing his or her job well, then we get a glimmering of understanding about this journey through this veil of tears. So it's I think that's what it really does, and that's what makes it important. And I think that's why people come back to it, and why, as long as there are readers, there'll always be novels.
Well, I think you put that with your accustomed fluency, and I'm sure we all wish we could do it as well as you can. I think we should open it up to some questions, and we have a couple of roving microphones. When you are in receipt of the microphone, would you mind standing up so that we can see where you are and talking into it? And we have a lady in a pink top.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your novel a lot. It was a real page-turner too. One very brief question and maybe a bit of a comment. It's a small question, but I just wondered why the psychoanalyst that Lysander consults happens to be an Englishman. Why didn't he go to, or why didn't you make him go to Dr. Freud himself? So that's one thing. The other thing, I was thinking, it's not by coincidence that you chose Lysander to be an actor, and he's the main, you write it really from his point of view, don't you? And so I think that's very useful, because he's a mixture of, he has great naivety as well as cunning and intelligence. I mean, he shows enormous naivety in his encounter with women, not just Hetty, but also Madame Touchene, I think she's called. But then I thought, well, it's also really a kind of Bildungsroman where he finds his self through this very complicated, convoluted story. And you said just now, he's a changed man at the end. So an actor has problems knowing sometimes who he is. Yes. So that's what I think.
Yes, well, I think the answer, the reason I made Dr. Ben Simon, the psychiatrist, an Englishman was there was an Englishman in Vienna, Ernest Jones, who worked very closely with Freud. So Ben Simon is sort of based on him. So there were English psychiatrists. I just thought it would be easier to have him speaking in English to his psychiatrist. So simple pragmatism is the answer. But also the other thing about Lysander changing is that one of the big themes in the novel is that it's not my theory, is that the 20th century began somewhere between 1914 and 1918. And so the novel is about becoming modern. And what is it to become modern? And I think it's to move from a kind of confidence and certainty into the age of uncertainty. And it's no accident that the book begins in blazing, brilliant sunlight and ends in London in 1915 on a dark, foggy, rainy night. Lysander is waiting for sunrise, but the sunrise isn't going to bring any clarity. And I think that's a very modern state of mind, and you can argue that it sort of changed around then. Philip Larkin's great poem, 1914, Never Such Innocence Again. There was a kind of loss of innocence over the First World War, and people's sensibilities changed. I mean, that wasn't just the war. It's Freud, there's all sorts of pressures, social orders breaking down, old hierarchies being seen as defunct, etc. But something in human sensibility changed around then, and Lysander's journey, in a way, is meant to exemplify that.
Yes, we have a lady in the second row. Juliet? Mm-hmm. Else after that? Hands up, please. Yes.
It's a double question, Will. You explained so clearly how you have two parts to the creation of a novel, the research and the invention, followed by the actual writing. And I wondered if during the creative act of putting it onto the paper, of making your imagination and your research and your thinking real, that the characters became themselves so powerful that you need to go back and look again at all the planning, because they inevitably take on a life of their own. So I wondered that. And the second thing was about what I might call the love scenes, about which you are so consistently brilliant. And I remember my father reading your first book, Good Man in Africa, and saying, that nice Will Boyd, you know, he's so wholesome. He seems so clean-cut. How could he possibly write these things? And I wondered, you know, with the sort of spectre of the bad sex award sort of hovering over anyone who dare write a love scene, whether you felt ever sort of wary before you actually went into that part of the writing.
Well, let me answer your first question. The characters, I mean, I do, in the period of composition, I will make enormous changes if I get a better idea. You know, if something strikes me, I remember when I was writing Stars and Bars, a character was only going to appear for 3 pages. I suddenly thought, no, she has to be in it for the whole novel. And the problems that caused my beautiful plan were enormous. So I'm not hidebound by it. But I also don't really believe in that your characters take you over. Because I spend so much time inventing them. They're so much my creatures that I know exactly. There's never that slightly romantic sense of somehow your God and your people are moving independently. As Vladimir Nabokov said when he was asked a similar question, he said, "No, I'm afraid all my characters are galley slaves and I'm the man on the deck with a whip." So I sort of control them as ruthlessly as that. But of course, you get other ideas. I don't hear voices coming from my characters, but they're vividly imagined. I can imagine any of them walking into this tent, for example, and I could tell you what they were wearing, what they'd had for lunch, etc. So they're living, breathing, 3-dimensional human beings. And as for sex, well, you know, if you're writing a novel in which there's a powerful attraction between man and a woman, or sometimes in my novels a man and a man, then I think you're sort of duty-bound to give it some credence. But there are all sorts of ways you can do this, and you're right, there are terrible, terrible pitfalls and pratfalls awaiting you if you don't get it right. And so it's a question of, I think, less is more. And I do write scenes of lovemaking or sex. Let's not beat about the bush. But they're done with I think an absolute narrative necessity to show how powerful the connection, or how bogus the connection is between the two people. But you do have to take a lot of trouble over it. And I mean, people often say there's a lot of sex in your novels, and I always say no, there isn't actually. There are just 2 or 3 really vivid bits of sex in my novels, and it sort of irradiates through. But I think in the case of Lysander and Hetty, for example, that if this was a mad passion, then somehow you have to see that on the page. Otherwise, you're shortchanging the reader. But you have to do it. Again, don't reach to the drawer-marked stereotype. You know, again, that's when you win the bad sex award.
Nevertheless, I'm sure many books will fall open.
Oh.
It's pretty steamy stuff. Over there.
I wonder if you could give us some insight into how you'll approach the James Bond assignment. You said earlier that when you write novels, you can write absolutely anything. Will you feel certain restrictions when you approach the James Bond? Will it be different to how you've approached novels before?
They're remarkably generous, the Fleming estate, in giving you almost total liberty. Obviously, I couldn't kill off James Bond in my, or have him hideously burned or something like that. But so there's a sense in which you have to, they want you to respect the conventions of the Bond novel. You know, his boss is called M. You know, I can't call him C. You know, so apart from that, it's very much up to you. I mean, they do. After you've been offered the job, they do ask you to produce a very long synopsis of the book you plan to write, so that they can see that if there are areas where the brand might be tarnished, that they can kind of warn you about it. But it's all done very diplomatically. But the thing to do, I mean, I think it's a fantastic job, and I'm really enjoying it. And it will be, I'm not going to try and channel Ian Fleming. And the pitch I made to the Fleming estate was that, you know, I'm a realistic novelist. I want to confront the human being that is James Bond, rather than the kind of cartoon character that we see in the films. Because the literary Bond is a totally different being from the ones we are familiar with in the movies. He's a far more complex, doubting, multi-layered character. And that's what's intriguing. So I'm not going to tell you very much about my new Bond novel, but it is set in 1969. So it's very much of the era of the Bond novels. Fleming died in 1964, so if he'd looked after himself a bit better, he might conceivably have written a novel in 1969. And it's not going to have, you know, hollow mountains filled with atom bombs. You know, it's a British spy on a mission without a mobile phone or the internet, thank God. And it will, I think, be all the more intriguing thereby. The wonderful option is, instead of having to invent your spy, you've got this iconic, mythic character, James Bond, with 14 novels written by Fleming, which you can go and which I'm rereading avidly with a pen in hand, and then around that construct your own story. I mean, in 1969, this is just to show you how much of a Bond bore I'm becoming. Bond is 45 years old, so he's a middle-aged man. The consensus is that he was born in 1924. So I think that's very intriguing, and I'd much rather stick to him being 45 than fudge it. And, you know, having been 45 myself, I do know you're not quite as limber and supple as you are age 25. And so, you know, maybe my Bond will be creaking a little, but all the more interesting thereby. But I'm you know, they've signed off on my story and my location, my villain, my women, my conclusion. So it's entirely my novel, but with a central character that is not of my invention.
Fascinating. Any more questions? And yes, over to the right. Thank you, Pip.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier on your obsession with places, and you listed quite a number that didn't include Africa. Now, two of your earliest books were about Africa. Were they written from a point of view of experience? And finally, do you have any thoughts of returning to Africa in its present-day situation?
Well, I was born in Africa. I was born in Ghana and raised there in Ghana and Nigeria. So my background is completely colonial, post-colonial West Africa. So I didn't have an obsession about Africa because it was my home. And I've written another book set in Africa, Brazzaville Beach. I don't know if you read that, which is... but I feel I've sort of written Africa out of my system at the moment. It's you know, a memory now, rather than when I started writing. It was still very vivid and present to me. I write a lot about Africa still, but as journalism or essays, and I sort of keep a pace with events on the continent as much as I can. But I don't have a plan to write one of my novels set there, but who knows? I may get a brilliant idea. But it doesn't feature amongst my lists of places that haunt me, because all those places were places I'd never been. So Africa did haunt me, but I knew it intimately. And so, there's, maybe St. Petersburg will take over. But there'll probably be somewhere I haven't visited. I have a Chekhov obsession, which is currently, burgeoning, and I have this strange desire to go to places Chekhov lived in. And maybe I'll be disappointed when I get there, but I've written a short story about Anton Chekhov, which is actually a real sign that the obsession is alive and well. But no, the Africa is just part of my blood in a way. So it's like anywhere you were born and raised, it's sort of permanently present.
Do we have another question? Yes, thank you. And anyone after that? Put their hand up and we can have the microphone to you.
I've only read one of your books so far, Any Human Heart, which I found a fantastic story, wonderful story. And, of course, throughout the book, you just wanted to know what was going to happen next. And so that's led me to wonder, when you write your books, whether the endings ever change as you write them, or are you sure what the ending's going to be when you start?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't start until I know how it's going to end. And on some occasions, I've actually written the last few lines of the book because I know exactly the kind of tone or cadence I want it to have. And then I have my destination, because the book, once I know how the book's going to end, the whole book is present to me in forms of notebooks and filing cards and diagrams and so on. And I then write, not particularly quickly, but I write with confidence every day. And I've also got no excuse for not writing, because I know if I'm in the middle of chapter 15, what's going to happen. So part of it is a way of keeping me disciplined, but it's more just a working method that works for some authors, but not all. I know a very successful novelist who gets an idea for an image or a scene, and then he kind of spirals around it and figures out where in the novel he's going to write this scene will take place. But that's each one to his method is my motto. But this works for me very well, and I very rarely change the ending. I may have rewritten it, but I can't think of any novel that I've written where I've thought, oh no, I got the ending wrong. And part of the whole principle of this method is so you aren't in these situations. So it's the endings are vitally important. So you fret and worry about them, and that's why I even sketch out the last few lines of the novel sometimes in advance.
I'd like to just come in here because one thing that interests me very much in this book and also the one I read most recently, which was Ordinary Thunderstorms, is the powerlessness of the individual in your books. That your people are cast quite unsuspecting into sort of these terrifying circumstances, and they are carried away on a sort of eddy, a river of almost grand proportions. Circumstances beyond their control. And I wonder what you're trying to say here. Is this that your feeling about life as a whole? It's that we're just way in out of our depth.
Yeah, I think I am saying that at a deeper level. Your present happiness, whatever that happens to be, whether it's deliriously happy or mildly happy or faintly aggrieved, whatever it is an incredibly fragile thing. And we can't go through life thinking that every minute, because it can be shattered and your life can be turned upside down within a second. But so we sort of assume we know what's going to happen tomorrow, but there's no guarantee. And I think that my kind of world view, if you like, is that this is actually a very healthy state of affairs to be in, because if you're aware that everything is fragile, it can be changed or shattered or broken at any moment, you advance with due caution and you take every bit of pleasure from the present moment you can, and actually it makes you much more calm than assuming there's a destiny for you and you'll live to a ripe old age, live happily ever after. it's just a kind of a sort of awareness of the role that chance plays in our lives and luck plays in our lives. And as Any Human Heart is a classic example, because at one stage Logan Mount Stewart, who has a real roller coaster of a life, says all your life is the accumulation of the good luck you've had and the bad luck you've had. So some people have a big pile of good luck and a small pile of bad luck, sometimes vice versa, but in most cases a bit of both. But if you acknowledge that it's all chance and random and happenstance and luck, then actually I think you move forward in a more serene and objective cast of mind.
That's a very good philosophy, but this awareness in you that anything can go wrong just about at any minute, where does that come from?
Well, it has happened to me at times, so I'm very conscious of it. I think also the other thing, if you have a religious faith, this philosophy of mine won't gain much purchase. So you have to be faithless, and because if there are gods up there controlling things, then ideas of luck and chance diminish. But if there is no deity, then here we are, as I said, on this great adventure. What's controlling it? And we all know things can go swimmingly and things can go disastrously, and you come home in the evening and get a terrible bit of news, and suddenly your life is... So I think to pretend life isn't like that is dishonest. And so I'm very conscious of giving my characters a really hard time in order to point out that nothing is certain, nothing is sure.
Yes, you do take it to quite an extreme, but all to the benefit of the story.
Yeah.
Do we have a last question from anybody? Yes, we do.
This is not a question about your novels, but more a question about you. Given that you spend 2 years preparing and 1 year writing, I was intrigued by your reference to your notebooks, and I wondered, also bearing in mind that you have an interest in endings, whether you were going to bequeath your notebooks, whether you were going to leave them to be sold, or whether you might burn them one day in the distant future, as Logan did. I was interested how you see your end and your conclusions.
Yes, I do keep all my notebooks, of course, but perhaps more interestingly, like Logan Mount Stewart, I've been keeping a journal, and that's a document of well over 1 million words now. I've been keeping it for 33, 34 years, which is completely fascinating to me, but deeply boring to everyone else. So I doubt it will ever see the light of day. But, I think that... I write my first drafts of my novel with a pen in an exercise book. I'm probably a member of that last pre-computer generation. I imagine every novelist under 40 writes on a computer now. There will be no more manuscripts. Maybe there'll be no more notebooks. And I spent many years at Oxford studying the work of Percy Shelley, and the Bodleian Library in Oxford has this massive archive of maybe catalogued now, but it wasn't when I was there. And you could go and just open a suitcase, and there was all this paper that Shelley had written on. And it was completely fascinating to sift through it and see what he'd been doodling as he'd been writing Ode to a West Wind. So it's so I think there's something there is real value in preserving an author's working notebooks, because it's full of, for scholars anyway, full of insights into their working practice. I always buy, I just bought the notebooks of F. Scott Fitzgerald, for example, which are very interesting. I bought the notebooks of Robert Frost, the American poet. Same sort of compulsion to see what in these rough musings brought about something more finished and polished. But I suppose as an author, your archive is your old age pension, and people do ask for it and offer sums of money, but I sort of just stick them in a cardboard box in an attic, and I don't really. I think if I sell my archive, it's a bit like choosing your plot in the graveyard. so I'm still at it, still going strong. So No, I don't think I don't have any plans to publish them, but they may be interesting to future generations, conceivably. But as the Stoic said, posterity is not our business, so who cares? You know.
That might be a good place to wind up.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Will for his really generous and illuminating insights into his art and craft. You know, such ample and full and fascinating responses. And obviously, I'd like to thank Virginia for her very astute and searching questions. I'd also like to say that after this, we've persuaded Will to conduct a literary walk between Claverley and Winchelsea. Just the other things to say is that the bookshop has managed to get hot off the press copies, the first paperback copies of Will's novel, which is very exciting. And finally, before I wind up, I'd like to thank Kevin and Prudence Watts for their most generous support of what has been a really special, thought-provoking event at the festival. So I'd like to thank our sponsors, but most especially William Boyd and Virginia Nicholson.